Hi, and welcome to the workshop series, Sweet Dreams. Today I'll be talking about everyday strategies for improving your child's sleep. My name is Dr. Julianna Sapienza, and I'm a clinical psychologist at Portland Psychotherapy Clinic. I've been working with kids and families for about 7 years now, and sleep is one of the biggest things that comes up with almost every child or teen that I work with. Sleep just is something that really a lot of kids struggle with. A lot of parents struggle with getting their kids to sleep. So I just wanted to do this workshop as sort of going over some basics of how to help your kids get the best night's sleep possible. So to get us started, I just thought I would give a little outline for what we'll be talking about today. I'm going to talk about several things. First, I'm just going to review sort of typical sleep patterns across development. So just kind of like, what should you expect of your child or teen in terms of their sleep at different ages? Then I'm going to talk a little bit about how to tell whether your child or teen is getting enough sleep, because sometimes that can be a little bit tricky. And we'll go over some sleep hygiene basics. We'll talk about light exposure and how that impacts sleep. We'll talk a little bit about the importance of a consistent sleep schedule and how to set up that kind of schedule. We'll talk about training your body for sleep and also developing a sleep routine. So just to get us started with sleep across different developmental ages, we'll talk a little bit about sleep in preschoolers and what that typically looks like. So I'm really talking about kids who are 3 to 5 years old. And for 3 to 5 year olds, typically kids in that age range need about 9 to 10 hours of sleep, and that's sleeping at night plus nap time. And naps usually do stop between the ages of 3 and 5 years old. So that's a pretty common pattern that kids are starting to give up those naps right around somewhere in that age range. By this time, kids should be sleeping through the night, although it's fairly common for kids not to be sleeping through the night for a variety of reasons. And nightmares and nighttime fears are fairly common in this age group and should be decreasing with age. Those kinds of things can sometimes concern parents. They are fairly common in the preschool age range. You probably don't need to get super concerned about those kinds of things unless they're coming up really, really regularly. Okay, so moving on to sleep in school-age children. This is kids 6 to 12 years of age. Typically, kids in that school age range usually need about 10 to 11 hours of sleep. On the other hand, on average, kids in this age range are getting usually more like 9 to 10 hours of sleep. So by school age, we're already starting to see kids getting a little bit less sleep than they actually need. There are several common difficulties with sleep during this age range. Those include falling and staying asleep. You start to see some sleepwalking, sleep terrors, teeth grinding, nighttime fears, nightmares, bedwetting, and snoring in this age range a little bit more. So for teenagers, that's kids in that 13 to 18 age range, you start to see sleep need going down a little bit. So instead of more like 10 to 11 hours, kids are starting to need more like 9 to 9 1/4 hours of sleep every night. But we're also starting to see that even more kids are not getting quite as much sleep as they need. So the average teenager sleeps about 7 hours a night on school nights, whereas they're really needing about 2 hours more than that. So you can see how kids, especially in this age range, are starting to get some sleep deprivation, especially as they're going through the week and missing out on a couple hours each night throughout the week. The other thing that you may have heard about teens is that their sleep schedule shifts, and that is absolutely true. After puberty, sleep schedules do shift later by about 2 hours, and so whereas kids were falling asleep earlier and waking up earlier, by their teenage years, their natural rhythm is really to fall asleep about 2 hours later and be wanting to wake up about 2 hours later. And so that can also be a big reason for some of that sleep deprivation. With school schedules, schools are typically starting fairly early in the morning, and that just doesn't work well with teenagers' natural rhythms, unfortunately. So one of the things that I get asked a lot about is, okay, so these are different sort of averages for kids at different age ranges, but how do I know whether my own child is getting enough sleep? Because of course, even though the average teenager, for example, needs 9 hours of sleep, everybody is a little bit different. And so, you may have some teenagers who truly don't need quite as much sleep as that. And on the other hand, you may have teenagers who need much more than that. And so it can be kind of tricky to figure out, is my kid or my teenager really getting enough sleep right now? So there are a couple of rules of thumb for kind of figuring out, hey, is my kiddo getting the sleep that they need, regardless of whether it matches what the averages are for a particular age range. So one telltale sign is daytime drowsiness. So if you're seeing that your child or teenager is drowsy during the day or easily is falling asleep, like while watching TV or in the car, that's a sure sign that they're probably not getting enough sleep at night. Another way to tell is kind of looking at how much do they sleep on weekends or days off. So if you have a kid who is going through the week and is getting about 8 hours of sleep a night, for instance, and then the weekend comes along and they're sleeping for like 12 hours, and that's a really good sign that, hey, during the week they're probably not getting quite enough sleep. What you really want to see is even on days off, they're still getting about the same amount of sleep as they are on days when they have to get up. So, you don't want to see this really big difference there. A little bit of a difference is normal and natural, but if you're seeing a really big difference between how much sleep they're getting on a weeknight and how much sleep they get when they're able to sleep in and wake up naturally, then that's a pretty good sign that your child isn't getting enough sleep. The next thing is mood and behavior. I think sleep really does impact mood really significantly and behavior. So if you're seeing a lot of irritability and crankiness, if you're seeing a lot of misbehavior and aggressive behavior, then you may want to think about whether kids are getting enough sleep. Certainly in my work with children and adolescents, one of the first things I do always ask about is sleep, because sleep does have such a big impact on mood and on behavior that, it's really one of the first things that I want to target if sleep isn't going the way it should. Sleep also impacts attention, memory, and thinking. So if you're noticing that your child seems not to be able to pay attention or is struggling with memory problems or having other thinking problems, it may be one reason for that may be sleep. So it might be one sign that they're just not quite getting enough sleep. And then the last sign is weight. So being overweight is actually related to sleep problems. So if your child is overweight, that may be, there are a lot of different reasons for that, but you may also want to think about sleep and how sleep figures into that. Okay, so I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking about some sleep hygiene basics. And these may be some things that you've heard about before, or they might be new to you. But we'll just talk a little bit about them one by one. The first point is really make sure that your child or teen is getting regular exercise. So when kids don't get enough exercise, they don't feel tired at bedtime. And so if they're having trouble sleeping and they're not exercising, one way to help might be making sure that they're getting that regular exercise. You do want to make sure that that exercise doesn't happen too close to bedtime. Because exercise does sort of tend to get us revved up. So you want to make sure that when your kids are exercising, it's earlier in the afternoon or earlier in the evening rather than, within an hour or two of bedtime. The next one is, of course, trying to make sure that your kids avoid caffeine. Hopefully a lot of, especially younger kids are avoiding caffeine altogether. Your teenager may be drinking some caffeine more, but you definitely want to make sure that they're not drinking caffeine within like that 4 to 6 hours of bedtime, because of course we all know that caffeine keeps us up. The next one is just making sure that kids have a light snack before bed. So going to bed hungry does make it more likely that you're going to have trouble falling asleep and staying asleep. You don't want your kids to have a really big, heavy meal before bed because that also disrupts sleep, but it can be helpful to have sort of a light snack close to bedtime. You want to pay attention to the sleep environment. So you want to make sure that your child's room is dark and cool and quiet. And when I say dark, I don't mean no night lights at all. I just mean, the lights are off, even if there is a night light in there. You want to make sure that it's relatively cool in your child's room. So, not warmer than about 75 degrees. And then of course, you want things to be fairly quiet in the room too. And then the last one is really making sure that conditions stay consistent throughout the night. So this is really something that I find that often gets overlooked, and actually a lot of the products that are marketed for sleep kind of don't take this into account. So, all kids, all people wake briefly about 2 to 6 times per night. It's part of our natural sleep cycle. And so that's not bad, but when we remember waking up and wake all the way up, if something is different in the room or about where you're sleeping. So that means things like if the lighting is different, if a child goes to bed with the hall light on and then it gets turned off before you guys go to bed, and so when they wake in the night it's off, or they have a night light that goes off. Another thing that I often see is sound machines that are sort of designed to be on for like 45 minutes while the child is falling asleep, but then programmed to turn off. You actually want that, if you're going to use a sound machine, you actually want that on all night. If you're going to have a hall light on, make sure it's something that's going to stay on all night. So it may require changing a couple of things, but you really do want to make sure that conditions stay consistent throughout the night for your kid. This is the other thing that often happens is kids will have parents in the room with them when they fall asleep, and that is another reason why kids might wake up in the night. So if a child falls asleep with you next to them or close by and then they wake up in the night, and you're not there, they've sort of learned that they need you to fall asleep. So they're much more likely to wake up and get up and come to get you. So that's another reason why nighttime wakings can happen. So if you have a child who's waking up a lot at night and they need you to fall asleep, then you really want to look at trying to help them transition to being able to fall asleep alone. Let's talk a little bit about light exposure and sleep. So you've probably heard to avoid electronics before bed, and that's because exposure to sunlight is supposed to regulate our sleep cycle. So when the sun goes down, it's a signal that tells our bodies that it's time to start getting tired. And so when you have a lot of lights on or a lot of screens right before bedtime, it kind of disrupts that natural process where our body says, oh, you know, it's getting dark out, and so I should start getting tired. So you really want to make sure that your child or teen is avoiding all backlit screens within the hour before bed. I know that some of those screens nowadays have like a nighttime setting, and there isn't a whole lot of research on that yet, but there is some research to suggest that those nighttime settings actually are not very effective at blocking the type of light that needs to get blocked. So it's better if your child must use screens to wear blue light blocking glasses, or to get a blue light blocking screen to put over the screen. With that said, there's really no reason at all for your child or teen to have electronics in their bedroom. It's really important, I think, to set that rule up when your child is young, so that you avoid those bigger battles as they get older. There's really, there shouldn't be any TVs in their room. There shouldn't be phones. Those should get put away at bedtime, because as much as you may say to kids, it's really important to make sure that you avoid that, the fact is that if it's there, they're probably going to use it. Related to some of the light stuff is that it can be helpful to dim lights within the hour before bed. So just like using side lights and like bedside lights instead of overhead lights, or if your switches have a dimmer on them, dimming those lights so that they're not getting quite so much light within that hour before bed. That can also be a really nice signal, especially for younger kids, that it is time to start preparing for bed. So just sort of letting them know, oh, when the lights get dim, then then we've got about an hour left before it's going to be bedtime. And then the last thing that I find sometimes gets overlooked in these discussions about light is that getting morning sunlight is actually really important in regulating your sleep cycle as well. And so so don't skip over that. I know a lot of kids are, going to school and things like that, so it can be hard to get them that morning sunlight, but it doesn't have to be a whole lot. It can be as simple as, making sure to sit in the sunshine while they're eating breakfast and getting ready for bed for about 20 minutes in the morning. So that morning sunlight is really key in helping regulate that sleep cycle. So one really important thing for sleep is maintaining a regular sleep schedule. And that means making sure that bedtime and wake up time doesn't vary by more than about an hour daily. That's because our bodies really have a hard time adjusting to the changes. So it really makes it harder for us to fall asleep if our schedules are inconsistent. And that, especially I think for teenagers, is a really hard thing, because they're feeling really tired, and so the tendency is, or the temptation is, I'm feeling so tired during the week, so I really need to catch up on sleep during weekends. And, while they can catch up a little bit, if they're really sleeping in until noon, then come Sunday night when it's time to get back to the school week, it's going to be much harder for them to fall asleep and on time, which then of course is going to make them more tired for the week. And then you start this whole cycle of going to bed late, maybe taking naps during the day, and it really just gets your sleep schedule off. For older kids and teens who are no longer napping, you really want to try and avoid naps. And as I said, this is, of course, a big temptation, I think, especially for teenagers who are tired to, come home in the afternoon and take a nap. If your teenager is really tired, naps can be okay as long as they're kept to something like 30 minutes in the early afternoon. So 30 minutes we know is fairly restorative without actually disrupting your ability to fall asleep at night. And then the last thing to keep in mind is making sure that you don't go to bed too early. So sometimes, both kids and adults at times will be tired during the day because maybe they didn't get a good night of sleep the night before. And so the temptation is, okay, well, I'm going to go to bed several hours earlier than I normally would. And the reason why that's not generally a good idea is because you probably are just going to end up lying there trying to fall asleep as opposed to actually falling asleep. Or if you do happen to fall asleep, or if your child does happen to fall asleep, they're much more likely to end up waking up really early. And then, of course, that feeds into that cycle of kind of being off. So, if your child is having a really tough day because they didn't sleep the night before, you may want to think more about, can you give them a 30-minute nap, or can you get them to sleep not more than an hour earlier than they normally would go to sleep. All right, so training your body for sleep. So our bodies, whether we know it or not, are really tuned into the cues around us. And this is especially true for sleep. So it's really important to be aware of what your body is sort of learning about sleep and about sleep associations. So related to this, you want to make sure that your bed is just for sleeping, so that your body associates being in bed with sleeping. So your bed is not for reading, it's not for homework, it's not for playing, it's not for timeouts, it's really just for sleeping. And that really helps you when you get in bed kind of cue in and think, all right, I'm in bed, it's time for sleeping. Similarly, getting into a routine helps your body start to make an association between that activity and sleep. And so that helps prepare you for sleeping. So as part of that, you definitely want to make sure that your child is getting some wind down time. Because if your adrenaline is rushing right before bed, it's going to be really hard to get to sleep. So for, ideally for about an hour, but if you don't have time for that, about 30 minutes before bed, you really want to make sure that you're giving your child some wind down time and doing activities that are relaxing and quiet. So some things that are generally good for that are doing like drawing or coloring, engaging in quiet play. Reading can be great. Bath time can be really nice. Listening to music is a really nice way of kind of calming down for the night. And then, of course, related to training your body for sleep is really making sure that you develop a consistent bedtime routine, because again, if your body learns, hey, when I do this thing, when I drink a cup of tea at night, that means that, soon I'm going to be going to bed, then your body starts to learn, oh, here's that tea, okay, it's time for me to start winding down. And, that doesn't necessarily happen overnight. If you haven't had a consistent bedtime routine, you probably aren't going to see much impact of establishing a routine for a few weeks. But after a few weeks of having done a consistent routine, your child or your teen or even you will probably start to notice that it's much easier to fall asleep. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about the bedtime routine and what a bedtime routine might look like. So there are a couple of important things to keep in mind when you're developing a bedtime routine for your child. Generally speaking, the bedtime routine should include approximately 5 activities. That's not set in stone, but you basically don't want so few activities that your child's not quite ready for sleep. But on the other hand, you don't want so many activities as part of the routine that it's overwhelming. Another important component of the bedtime routine is that it move in one direction towards the sleep environment. And what I mean by that is making sure that the steps of your routine just get closer to the bedroom as the routine goes on. So you wouldn't, for instance, want to start with having your child put on their pajamas in their bedroom and then go downstairs for a snack and then come back to the bathroom and then and then go back into the bedroom for stories. You'd want to start with the thing that's the furthest away from their bedroom. So for instance, the bedtime snack maybe is the furthest thing away. So you'd do the snack and then, you'd move closer to the bedroom, maybe that's the bathroom, and do the brushing teeth, going to the bathroom, those kinds of things. And then, finally when you get into the bedroom, you want to make sure that the bedtime routine is such that you stay in the bedroom. So, you're reading books in the bedroom and then it's time for bed. You're not going to leave and go to another place in the house. The last thing is that really this routine should be accompanied by some kind of chart or list or book. So that means, having some sort of visual cue for your child so that they know, okay, this is what we do. We always do it in this order. And that's helpful for a couple reasons. Those kinds of charts or visuals are helpful for kids to sort of remember what to do, but they can also be really helpful for you because then you are able to say, oh, the next thing on the chart is going to the bathroom. Nope, we're not going to do playing now because that's not part of our chart. So the chart says next thing is going to the bathroom, so that's what we're doing next. Some kids, younger kids, especially like the concept of sort of the bedtime train. So if your child is into trains, they might enjoy sort of a chart that's kind of themed like a train, and that each activity is sort of a stop on the train ride. So you get on the bedtime train and you stop for a snack, and then you make your way up to the next stop, which is the bathroom, where you do a couple of other things. It's also helpful because then you can say, well, the bedtime train just goes forward, it doesn't go backwards. So we're not going back to downstairs to get X, Y, or Z. Or you may be able to ask, if they've asked for something that's not on that list, is that a stop on the bedtime train? Nope, the bedtime train doesn't stop at that station, so we can't do that right now. So here's just a sample bedtime chart that you might use. Again, yours doesn't have to look like this. Some people like having it look like a chart, that's posted somewhere that their kids can see. Other kids like having it in book form, so each page would have one step of the routine and a picture. Especially for younger kids, having those pictures there is really important because if they're not reading yet or not reading well yet, you want to make sure that they know what that routine is without having to read it. For older kids, you may or may not need to have those pictures. For older children, older elementary age children, they may still like having those pictures, but that's really up to you and your child. And normally this would be something that you and your child would hopefully do together. So you'd talk about what their bedtime routine is and put it together. So you might have their input on, do they want it to look like a book? Do they want it to look like a chart? What do they want with it? And then you may have their help in either drawing the pictures or picking the pictures out from the internet or from a magazine, so that they get some ownership over what it looks like. And again, I'll just highlight a couple of things. So one thing about this chart is that it moves in the direction toward the bedroom. So like I said, if your kitchen is the furthest thing from your kiddo's room, that would be having a snack would be the first thing on the list, and then you'd go do your bathroom stuff and then move on into the bedroom. This is just a sample. You might have different things that your family does. So having a bath might be on the list. Singing a song or giving a hug might be on the list. So there's nothing super special about these particular activities, but you just want to kind of make sure that you've got them all down. It's not an overwhelming number of activities, and they move closer and closer to their bedroom or where they're going to sleep. All right, so I've talked about several different strategies for improving sleep, and I thought I'd just end sort of by giving you some tips on how to implement these strategies most effectively. So generally speaking, if you've taken a look at some of the things that I've talked about today and thought, man, there are a bunch of different things that we could be doing differently, that's okay. But remember, try not to focus on more than one or two habits to change at first. So you really want to make sure that if there's a lot that you feel like you could change, just pick one or two at first and really start there. I would say that in general, one of the things that I work with families first on is if you don't have a regular bedtime routine that has a chart or a book that goes with it, that's usually one of the very first things that I do. So that can be a really lovely place to start. But it's really up to you. Just make sure that you're not trying to handle too much, because if you pick a bunch of habits to change, you're probably going to get fairly overwhelmed, and your child may get fairly overwhelmed, and it'll be pretty hard to make progress on any of them. The next thing you want to do is really make sure that you talk about what's going to change with your child and get their input about it. So, if you, I don't know, let's say you've decided that the hall light needs to go off before your child goes to bed because it goes off during the evening, then you want to talk to your child about why you're turning that light off and make a plan with them about, if it's going to be a struggle for them to have that change, how are you going to help them adjust? Are you going to start with, just dimming the hall light at first and work towards turning it all the way off? Or are you going to at first have a night light out there? So make sure that your child sort of is aware of what the change is going to be. In some cases, you may want to consider rewards. So if you're changing something that may be difficult for your child, so for instance, having the hall light off might be something that's tricky for your child at first. And so that might be something to reward them for. So letting them know that if they can fall asleep with the light off, then they're going to earn some sort of small reward in the morning. And you can use that same kind of idea for other sorts of things, just to help them stay motivated. A third thing that can help is making a calendar and tracking your success. So, kind of just noting down on a calendar, both for you and for your kid, what you did and whether you made that change that night. So, let's say you're starting with the bedtime chart, and, just really making a calendar and noting, with either a sticker or a smiley face or something like that, hey, we used the bedtime chart tonight. Great job, us. And there are a couple of reasons for that. For one thing, it can be rewarding for your child. But for another thing, there's a lot of research that shows that simply tracking a change makes it more likely that you're going to maintain it. So even if it seems like a small thing, if you track whether you've been doing it regularly, you're much more likely to follow through and make it a habit. And then the last thing is, if you're in the situation where you're feeling like you need to change a lot of things, once you've made a change, and that change is pretty consistent, like, say you're using that bedtime chart really consistently and you kind of are in the habit of doing that, then you can use these same steps with a new habit. Well, I just want to say thank you so much for joining me today. If you have any questions after the workshop, this is my contact information. So if you need to contact me for any reason, please don't hesitate to reach out.